I wanted to respond to your video. I agree with you, but I've also put a fair amount of thought into the moral or ethical side of this, which you touched on only briefly. I've come up with something that seems quite logical to me. I divide animals into 3 or sort of 4 categories for the purposes of this concept. The first category is anything that is sentient or self-aware in at least a similar way to humans. So we have the higher primates, including humans, and cetaceans like whales, dolphins, porpoises, etc. Of course, everything is a continuum. There are no black and white lines of separation. So we could probably put some of the large predators on the borderline of this category. None of them pass the mirror test as far as I know, but their brains are not that much less complex than the other animals I mentioned here. Their behavior and abilities seem to indicate a sort of partial self-awareness too. Being at least somewhat self-aware is the main criteria for this category. So I would argue it's not ethically acceptable to kill these animals for food. Of course, as a human, I would place at least a slightly higher value on the lives of humans as members of my own species. You could argue the logic of this, but it is how we think about things due to being a social species where group survival was a big evolutionary advantage that led to us surviving as a species. So that's how there are sort of 4 categories. However, arguing how we should treat chimps versus people or the implications to our legal code are beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here. So for the purposes of this concept, it's better to think of it as a single group. The next category is where the vast majority of animals are, including the vast majority of our typical food animals. These animals don't really have self-awareness, but they are conscious in some way and definitely can feel pain. These would be animals that have a central nervous system and the brain anatomy required to experience pain in some way. I think it is ethically acceptable to slaughter these animals for food because they are lacking that self-awareness. However, their ability to experience things like pain, at least on some level, gives us an obligation to be humane, since we do have the ability to do so. Slaughter should be very quick, and there should be standards for their treatment. I think it's a fallacy to make an assumption that meat eaters approve of the practices of the meat industry. Some of us, including myself, would like to see regulations to improve the conditions for these animals. You also have groups like PETA who take the worst examples of cruelty they can get their hands on and then present it as if that is the typical way things are done. That's a gross misrepresentation and obvious propaganda. So, the main idea with this category is to regulate slaughter procedures and living conditions to minimize the suffering of animals. The last category is animals that really can't experience pain in any way even remotely like what we feel. These would be animals without a central nervous system. You could even include most fish in this category because while they have some sort of central nervous system, they lack the brain anatomy to have experiences. The brain activity of most fish is heavily dominated by brainstem function. They have little else to their brains, so there is little else going on there. I'm sure you've all heard the quote, "Don't eat anything with a face." Well, some of these animals don't have a face. Not that that's germane to the argument, but I thought I'd point that out. So this is a category where the only consideration you need to have is that of ecology. I also want to point out the argument I tend to hear for why it's alright to eat plants is because they can't feel pain. You could apply that logic here too. One final thing I want to address is that factory farming has its problems, even with just raising crops. You see, when the land is cultivated and the harvest is done, lots of little creatures get killed in that process. Plenty of these creatures are rodents, and they can feel pain. So, if someone eats the products of factory farming, you are really just fooling yourself if you think you have no part in animal suffering. The only people who can make that claim are subsistence farmers. I use logic and scientific data to come up with actual reasoning for these ethical views. That's something I never see in arguments that involve the ethics of eating. So, let me know what your thoughts are on what I've presented here.